Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you've all had a great week. If you are new, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So today we are talking about the mass murder of 7 people that occurred in Elkland, Missouri in 1987. And I was pretty surprised when I checked YouTube to see if anyone else had covered this case, and I really didn't see any coverage. Just some old news reports that I will be including throughout this video. So these 7 murders actually wiped out an entire family.
Right now, 7 people are dead. This family is gone. The community is in shock.
There's no one left in this immediate family.
Elkland, Missouri is a very small town. I'm talking like a few hundred people at this time. And this family was very well known to the community. So everyone was in total shock when news about the murders broke. But they were even more shocked when they learned who had committed the murders. This initially looked like an open and shut case, but some very interesting information would eventually start to come to light that would turn the entire case on its head. And it didn't take long for police and the town to realize that there was much more to this story, and nothing was as it seemed. This case does unfortunately involve children, so just please keep that in mind before you watch this one. And now let's just go ahead and jump right in. At around 6 a.m. on September 25th, 1987, the Webster County Sheriff's Department received a call. A violent attack has just occurred on a dairy farm in the tiny town of Elkland, Missouri. The caller, 36-year-old Jim Schnick, tells the dispatcher that the attack occurred in his home and he had been shot and he needed immediate help. The police arrived on scene to find Jim Schnick on the kitchen floor, writhing in pain and unable to stand. He had been shot twice, once in the leg and once in the abdomen. As paramedics are tending to Jim and preparing to take him to the hospital, police ask him, what happened? Who did this? And he says that at first he didn't know who the intruder was. It just looked like a shadowy figure. He says that the person shot him in the leg, but that Jim was able to get a kitchen knife and fight the attacker off, and eventually he stabbed him to death. And it wasn't until the attacker was dead that Jim realized who it was, his 14-year-old nephew, Kirk Buckner. And as police walked further into the home, they found Kirk's body lying in the hallway, and he was clutching a .22 caliber pistol in his right hand. And Jim had not been Kirk's only target. Jim's wife, 30-year-old Julie, was found in the couple's bedroom. She was also deceased from 2 gunshots to the forehead. Julie was found still lying in her bed and still under her blankets, and it looked as though she had been killed in her sleep. Jim and Julie's 2 young children, 8-year-old Jamie and 6-year-old Mindy, were not harmed in the attack. In fact, they had slept through the whole thing. Jamie had eventually woken up right after the attack, and he had helped his father to get the phone and call the police. But before the police had even arrived on the scene, Julie's parents, Jean and Alfred Buckner, had shown up to the Schnick farm. And when they came in and saw Jim lying wounded on the kitchen floor and then their grandson, Kirk, lying dead in the hallway, they were in total shock. And when they asked Jim what had happened, he said, quote, "Kirk came in the door shooting." Jim was taken to St. John's Regional Health Center in the nearby town of Springfield to be treated for his injuries. And Julie's parents took Jamie and Mindy back to their home, and they tried to come to terms with the fact that they had just lost their daughter and one of their grandchildren in one day. But unfortunately, things were about to get so much worse for this family. While police were still processing the crime scene at the Schnick farm, a sheriff was sent over to the Buckner farm to let them know that their oldest son was dead. And not only that, but that Kirk had killed his father's sister Julie and had also tried to kill his Uncle Jim. Deputy Sheriff Don Rowe was given this unfortunate task, so he heads over to the Buckner farm, which is only about 6 miles down the road from the Schnick farm. And pretty much as soon as Sheriff Rowe arrives at the Buckner farm, he can tell that something is not right. This is a dairy farm, and the family would normally be up and moving around, tending to the cows, but it was eerily quiet this morning. Sheriff Rowe walks up to the door and knocks, but there's no answer. But the door is unlocked, so he walks in. This house is in very bad shape, and it's pretty small, especially for a family of 6. 35-year-old Steve Buckner, his wife 36-year-old Jan, and their 4 boys had definitely outgrown the home. So much so, in fact, that Kirk Buckner had recently been sleeping in the bed of a truck that had a camper shell attached. But there was no money for a bigger home. This was the 80s and right in the middle of the farm crisis, and people all across the country were losing their farms left and right during this time. And the Buckners, like Lots of other families in the area were pretty severely impacted by the crisis. In fact, Steve and Jan were almost 2 years behind on their mortgage payments. As Sheriff Rowe entered the home, he noted the terrible state that it was in. The house was extremely dirty. It was in total disarray. Several piles of muddy clothes were lying on the floor, and there were flies everywhere. Sheriff Rowe called out, but there was no answer. So he continued to walk through the house until he made an absolutely horrific discovery. He found the dead bodies of Kirk's 3 younger brothers, 8-year-old Dennis, 7-year-old Timmy, and 2-year-old Michael. Dennis and Timmy had been killed in their beds. They had each been shot twice in the head, and baby Michael was found in his playpen, shot twice in the temple. This was like nothing Sheriff Rowe had ever seen before. And now all 4 of the Buckner boys were dead, but their mother and father, Jan and Steve, were not found in the home. During the search of the outside of the Buckner property, Julie's body was eventually discovered lying in the yard near the milk barn, and she had been shot in the back of the head. So now the only member of the Buckner family that's unaccounted for is Steve. The home and outside of the property has been thoroughly searched and no one can find him. Police start to think that there's a chance that Steve killed his family and then took off. So now there is a full-on manhunt for Steve Buckner. So while the search for Steve is going on, police start processing the Schnick and Buckner properties. Now that there are 2 crime scenes to process, Webster County Sheriff's Department threw pretty much every person they had available onto this case. The bodies of the victims were all loaded up and taken into the county coroner's office for autopsies, and lots of blood-stained items were taken from the homes and put into evidence. The jeans that Jim Schnick was wearing during the attack had been cut off of him and taken in as well. The knife that Jim had used to stab Kirk Buckner with and the .22 caliber pistol were also bagged and submitted into evidence. And later that day, Steve Buckner was finally found. Some people out searching discovered Steve's body lying in the Pleasant View Cemetery, which was located about halfway between the Schnick and Buckner farms. And he had been shot in the back of the head. So this put to rest any suspicions that the police had that maybe Steve had killed his family and then taken his own life. The entire Buckner family has now officially been completely wiped out. The day after the murders, Sheriff Rowe paid Jim Schnick a visit in the hospital. The 2 of them had been friends for years before this, but Sheriff Rowe made it clear to Jim that he was there that day as a sheriff, not as a friend, and he had some questions to ask. He has Jim go through the entire series of events again, but this time in much more detail. Jim says that he had been up early that morning because he had a cow that was getting ready to birth a calf, and he was out checking on her. As he was leaving the barn and heading back towards his house, he saw flashes of light and heard gunshots coming from inside his home. He says he ran inside his home, and since it was still pretty dark outside at this time, all he could make out was a shadowy figure standing in the hallway. This person shot at Jim and hit him in the leg, but Jim managed to grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen and he attacked the intruder with it, eventually killing him. And during the struggle, Jim had been shot a second time, this time in the abdomen. After the intruder was finally dead, Jim discovered that it was his nephew Kirk. As for Jim's injuries, they were considered superficial. The shot to the abdomen ended up being just a surface wound. The bullet had just barely grazed the skin. The leg injury was slightly more serious, but not life-threatening at all. The hospital was actually willing to treat Jim and send him home that same day, but Jim had requested to stay in the hospital for a couple of days. Sheriff Rowe takes Jim's statement, he thanks him, and then he leaves. Now, news of this tragedy traveled extremely fast. Like I said, Elkland is tiny. There's actually only one store in the town of Elkland called Hannah's Fast Stop, and it served as kind of a meeting place for the townspeople. So after the news broke, people started gathering at the store and talking and grieving together.
This morning, inside the small town's only store, some people were hearing the news for the first time.
Well, I was shocked because, this community doesn't usually have things like this. And I've lived here for 22 years, and it's not that kind of community.
Today, the store served as an informal news center for neighbors, with dozens calling to check on what they'd heard.
The Schnick and Buckner families were both extremely well known to the residents, so this really hit the town hard. But what shook them even more was the fact that 14-year-old Kirk Buckner was now believed to be the murderer of all 7 victims.
It is so horrible, almost hard to imagine. A teenage boy went on a shooting rampage today in rural southern Missouri, killing his family before his uncle finally killed him. 14-year-old Kirk Buckner of Elkland appears to be the one behind this tragedy. He got up this morning and started killing his family. His crime happened in several spots around Webster County.
This is the Buckner home, where police think 14-year-old Kirk Buckner began his murder rampage. This house became a morgue for the Buckner children, 2-year-old Michael, 6-year-old Timmy, and 8-year-old Dennis. Police found the body of their mother, Jan, out back by a barn. Preliminary report showed all had been shot in the head with a small caliber revolver.
It was a small .22 cheap gun.
Police found the body of father Steve Buckner in a cemetery a short distance away.
Police put together a timeline of events that made the most sense to them based on Jim's statement and evidence at the scene. They believe that Kirk Buckner woke up that morning, walked into the house and grabbed his mother's .22 caliber pistol, then killed each of his 3 brothers. He then walked outside where his mother Jan was tending to the cows and he shot her in the back of the head. Then he spotted his father Steve sitting in the family truck, so he shot him twice in the back of the head, got into the truck, and drove to Pleasant View Cemetery down the road, where he dragged his father's body out of the truck and then left him there hidden in the weeds. He then continued driving down the road a few miles until he arrived at the home of his Aunt Julie and Uncle Jim Schnick. He parked the truck, walked inside, and found his Aunt Julie asleep in her bed and shot her twice in the forehead. Then his Uncle Jim came into the house, and that's when the struggle between the two of them ensued. The students at Marshfield High School, where Kirk had been a freshman, could not believe this story.
It just, you wouldn't think that something like that would happen when you're that young, at that age. I don't think I could do that, and I don't think anybody else could, and I don't think he done it.
Kirk was known as a mild-mannered and very friendly person. He was known around not just the school, but around the entire community in general as just very helpful, respectful, and kind. He was described as being his mother's right-hand man. He absolutely loved and adored his mom. His teachers had nothing but good things to say about Kirk's behavior and performance in class. He was an above-average student, and he never gave them any trouble. It just seemed completely out of character for Kirk to do something like this. However, a friend of Kirk's did come forward and say that he had been acting a little strange right before the murders. This boy's name was Bill Shoemaker, and he and Kirk had been friends for a while. Bill had actually saved Kirk from a near-drowning experience in 1985, which brought them even closer. But the two had drifted a little in the recent months, and they had started kind of hanging out with different groups of people. However, Bill said that the day before the murders, Kirk had just shown up unannounced at his home. They spent the day together, they had lunch together, but Bill said that Kirk was very quiet all day. He said the visit was just random and Kirk seemed kind of depressed. Another friend said that Kirk would sometimes talk badly about Steve, calling him lazy, and on one occasion, Kirk had allegedly said that he wanted to kill his father. Investigators had to come up with a motive for the murders, and to do that, they had to dig deeper into the Buckners' lives. Steve and Julie had been struggling a lot financially lately, and they were at risk of losing their 110-acre dairy farm. As I mentioned earlier, this is all happening during the farm crisis. Lots of farms were on the verge of bankruptcy, so families were selling their properties at well below value just to survive. Others, like the Buckners, had not sold their farms, but instead they were just doing whatever they could to make it day to day, sometimes depending on the kindness of family and neighbors to put food on the table. And because Steve and Julie couldn't afford to hire any help for their farm, they leaned heavily on their children, especially Kirk, since he was the oldest. Kirk would wake up well before the sun was even up, and he would climb out of his makeshift room in the bed of the truck, and he would immediately start doing chores around the farm. And then once he was done with that, he would get himself ready for school and wait for the bus. So by the time Kirk got to school every morning, he was already exhausted. And not only did Kirk help with the chores on the farm, but he also found odd jobs around town. He was willing to help with pretty much any job that neighbors had so that he could earn extra money for his family. And the neighbors who saw the Buckner kids pretty much every day said that Kirk always had a smile on his face, and he was always willing to happily lend a helping hand to anyone. But police concluded that even though on the outside Kirk seemed as though he was handling all of these responsibilities really well, he was actually a ticking time bomb. He just couldn't take living in poverty and working long hours any longer. And they thought he likely resented his father for creating this life for the family and for putting so much pressure on him. So Kirk had just snapped and went on a killing rampage. But why had Kirk killed his Aunt Julie and attempted to kill his Uncle Jim as well? Well, it turns out that there was a bit of a family feud going on between the Schnicks and the Buckners. Julie and her brother Steve had always been very close growing up, so when they each got married, the two couples would hang out together all the time. And the families had a really good relationship in the beginning. But when the farm crisis hit the Buckner family especially hard, Steve started asking for more and more help from Jim and Julie. The Schnick farm wasn't hurting as much as the Buckners, so they weren't struggling as much financially. Also, Jim didn't hunt or fish like most of the other members of the town, so he spent his spare time working extra jobs to make more money. He was also a volunteer firefighter, and he had hopes of eventually getting hired on as an official employee. Jim Schnick had always been very willing to help his brother-in-law out in any way that he could, but Steve allegedly started taking advantage of the situation. According to Jim, he would take farm equipment without asking. Sometimes he would take Jim's tractor and return it with no gas, or sometimes he just wouldn't return it, things like that. Also, Steve would sometimes have his children ask Jim and Julie for food when their family had none. And eventually, Jim started feeling like he was being taken advantage of. In his mind, Steve was not doing enough to take care of his family. So the men started to argue more and more, and before long, they were just totally at odds and not really speaking. So investigators thought that this was potential motive for Kirk to take some aggression out on the Schnick family. On September 28th, all 6 of the Buckners and Julie Schnick were laid to rest in a group funeral at Timber Ridge Cemetery. Jim Schnick was allowed to leave the hospital to attend the funeral, but because of his injuries, he couldn't walk to the gravesite. So instead, he sat in a nearby parked car and just watched. Some family and friends would periodically walk over to the car to talk to Jim, and they would offer kind words and offer him help if he needed it in the future. But Jim didn't really say anything. He just kind of stared blankly. The entire town of Elkland showed up, and lots of people from neighboring towns as well. And in the end, over 800 people were in attendance at the funeral that day. People who attended said that seeing those 7 caskets all lined up in a row, one of which was very small for 2-year-old Michael Buckner, was such an upsetting sight. There were 4 ministers performing the service, and one of them said that Kirk was just a troubled youth and, quote, something in Kirk had just reached a point and he snapped. There were lots and lots of tears and hugs as the family was laid to rest. So as the days went by, more and more findings started rolling in, and investigators started noticing that little pieces of this puzzle weren't fitting together properly. First of all, the day after the funeral, a phone call came into the sheriff's department from one of Kirk Buckner's teachers. She had heard in the news that the .22 caliber pistol was found in Kirk's right hand, but she told police that Kirk was left-handed. This was a pretty significant piece of information that even Kirk's friends and family hadn't mentioned, and it caused investigators to take a really close look at the evidence. It was also determined that all of the victims were shot with Jan Buckner's .22 caliber pistol. This pistol would have needed to be reloaded at least twice throughout these attacks, but there were no shell casings found at either of the crime scenes. And in order to reload this pistol, a retaining pin had to be used. Now, I know literally zero about guns, but according to my research, the retaining pin had to be removed from the pistol in order to be reloaded. Once it was reloaded, the pin had to be placed back, or the gun could not fire. And when the pistol was found in Kirk's right hand, the retaining pin was missing. The investigators did go back to each of the crime scenes to look for the retaining pin, but friends and family had already thoroughly cleaned up both homes, so nothing was found. And the autopsy report on Kirk really created a lot of questions for investigators. It was found that Kirk had been stabbed 3 times and he had been shot 3 times. One of the bullet wounds was determined to be fatal. It had entered Kirk's body through his back and hit his heart. So if the bullet wound to the heart had been fatal, how did Kirk manage to get the gun back from the killer? And we know that Kirk was shot with the same pistol used in the other murders. So how could that pistol have been used to kill Kirk and then also ended up in his right hand unless someone had placed it there after he was dead? And once police looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized that there was not much blood in the hallway where Kirk had been found. If Kirk really had been stabbed and shot where Jim said he had in the hallway, then there should have been a large amount of blood found near Kirk's body, but there wasn't. And Kirk was not a large kid. He was estimated to be between 120 and 140 pounds, and he was described as tall and scrawny. So police questioned whether or not Kirk would have been able to physically drag his father's 250-pound body from the truck and into the weeds in the cemetery all by himself. Things are just not making sense anymore, and it's really starting to look like Kirk had been set up to take the fall for these murders. So investigators started taking a closer look at Jim Schnick, and it was discovered that Jim and Julie were having some pretty serious marital problems leading up to the murders. Julie had just recently discovered that Jim had been having an affair with a 37-year-old mother of two named Nancy Bruner, and this affair had been going on for almost 2 years. Nancy Bruner was brought in for questioning, and at first, she didn't really give up much information. She told them that she and Jim had met a couple of years ago, but they were just friends. But a couple of days later, Nancy showed back up at the station, and she said that she had not been truthful in that first interview. She ended up telling them everything about her relationship with Jim. The affair began in November of 1985 when Jim had went to see Nancy for a chest injury. At the time that Jim and Nancy met, she was working out of her home as a paramedical examiner, and Jim had called her to set up an appointment for treatment for his chest injury. Jim and Nancy ended up hitting it off in that first meeting, and what was supposed to be a 15-minute appointment turned into 4 hours. The two of them reportedly bonded over their love for animals and country living, and they started a full-on relationship after that very first day. They would meet up to have sex at least twice a week in the beginning, and Jim would say that Julie was like, quote, hot oil being poured all over him. Now, according to Nancy, when they first met, Jim told her that he was divorced, which Nancy claims she believed. She was not from Elkland. She was living in a town called Fairgrove, so there is a chance that Nancy didn't know that Jim was married. Jim also told Nancy that he had served in the military and fought in Vietnam, and that he had a cousin from Texas who had just recently died, and Jim would be executing their estate soon and was expecting to get between $50,000 and $60,000. Both of these claims were lies, by the way. Eventually, Nancy did find out that Jim was not actually divorced. However, the two continued their relationship because Jim promised that he and Julie were getting divorced soon. And by August of 1987, Jim had convinced Nancy that he and Julie were no longer together and that the two of them would soon be able to get married. Like, they were making actual plans to get married. So Jim and Nancy decided to plan a trip so that their children could meet each other finally. Since they were all going to be a family soon, it was time that all of the children met. And they made plans to meet up at an amusement park called Silver Dollar City near Branson, Missouri. So Nancy arrives at the amusement park with her two kids, and now she's just standing there waiting for Jim to show up. And when Jim does finally arrive, he has his two kids and his wife with him. As far as I can tell, Julie didn't know anything about Nancy at this point. It just seemed like she had unwittingly walked into this situation, and Jim managed to keep the two women apart so that Julie wouldn't know anything about Nancy. Nancy did manage to secretly talk to Jim very briefly at the amusement park, and she was like, what the hell? Why is your ex-wife here with you? She thinks that Jim is either divorced or separated at this point. And so he just tells Nancy, like, look, I'll talk to you about it tonight. But apparently that never happened. And now Nancy was pissed. So a few days after the trip, she called the Schnick home and Julie answered the phone. And Nancy just point blank asked Julie if she and Jim were still married, and Julie said that they were. And if Julie didn't already know about the affair, she definitely knew now. Nancy took this opportunity to ask Julie some more questions about Jim. During this conversation, she learned that Jim had never served in Vietnam, and he never inherited any money from a dead cousin from Texas. After learning all of this, according to Nancy, she she ended the relationship, and this was about 5 weeks before the murders. She said that she encouraged Jim and Julie to seek marriage counseling. She said that if she wasn't meant to be with Jim, that she wanted the two of them to work things out. It's believed that Julie did tell Jim that she wanted a divorce after she found out about the affair. Now, this next part is a little confusing because there isn't that much information out there, but I still wanted to mention it. So Jim and Julie did actually end up going to see a marriage counselor, but in newspaper reports of this case, it states that Nancy claimed to be a church marriage counselor, and Jim said that he had had sex with her as part of his therapy. So I don't know if this is alluding to the fact that Nancy was acting as a marriage counselor for Jim and Julie. It doesn't make sense that Julie would be okay with something like that. So maybe this wasn't the case. But either way, Jim claimed to have had sex with Nancy as part of some treatment. And I really wish I knew more about this because it just sounds so bizarre. Nancy also said that she and Julie were starting to become friends in the weeks leading up to the murders, which to me almost makes Nancy look a little suspicious. And then police learned that in addition to the affair, which Jim quickly admitted to, there was another major issue going on between Jim and Julie. According to Jim, Julie had told him about a sexual assault that she had suffered when she was 8 years old, and her abuser had been none other than her own brother, Steve Buckner. Now, I don't know with 100% certainty that this assault actually happened, or if Jim just made this up to make Steve look bad. So I did a lot of digging, and I managed to find one other person who backed this claim up. One of Julie's closest friends said that over the years, she had encouraged Julie to go see a counselor to discuss the assault because it was something that Julie understandably still struggled with. So once I read that a close friend had been told by Julie that this assault happened, that really made me believe that Jim just hadn't made this up. Jim said that when he found out about the abuse, he couldn't look at his brother-in-law the same anymore, which is understandable. But he also said that it caused him to have trouble being intimate with Julie. The two of them pretty much stopped having sex after that. And this, of course, just added to the feud between the two families. Police also discovered that two $50,000 life insurance policies had been taken out on Julie Schnick. There was also a policy on Jim as well, and Nancy Bruner had been the one to sign off on his physical exam. And of course, we all know that when you have a murdered spouse and there's an insurance policy or an affair involved, it looks really suspicious. But what makes this even more suspicious to me is that Jim had told Nancy that he would be getting $50,000 to $60,000 for that cousin's estate. These life insurance policies taken out on Julie were for $50,000. It could just be a coincidence, but that definitely seems a little sketchy to me. It was also rumored that the Schnicks were in line to inherit the Buckners' 110-acre dairy farm in the event that they all died. So based on all of this evidence, investigators put together a new timeline of events. They now believe that in the early morning hours of September 25th, Jim had lured Steve Buckner over to his farm by telling him he had some work he needed help with. It's not really known how, but police theorized that somehow Jim had managed to get a hold of Jan Buckner's .22 caliber pistol in the days leading up to the murders. According to one of the neighbors, Jim was at the Buckner home a few weeks before the murders, so he could have used this visit as an opportunity to steal Jan's gun. And when Steve had arrived at the Schnick farm early that morning, that gun was used to shoot him twice in the back of the head. He then loaded Steve up in the Buckner family truck and drove a few miles down the road to the cemetery where he dumped the body. Then Jim got back into the truck and drove a few more miles down the road until he arrived at the Buckner farm, where he found his sister-in-law, Jan, outside near the barn tending to the cows. He also shot her in the back of the head as she attempted to run. Kirk Buckner would have already been up and helping with the chores and getting ready for school, and he likely would have heard all of the commotion and tried to protect his mother. But Jim had managed to kill Kirk by shooting him 3 times, with the fatal shot going through his back and hitting his heart. So Kirk had been killed at the Buckner farm, not the Schnicks. Jim then walked inside of the Buckner home and shot each of his other 3 nephews as they were lying in their beds. He then picked up Kirk's dead body and loaded him into Steve Buckner's truck and drove back to his own house. And this part of the story is backed up by the fact that Kirk's blood was found inside of the Buckner truck. Jim had already decided that Kirk would be the fall guy. It's believed that Jim carried Kirk into his house and laid him down in the hallway and then stabbed his already dead body in the chest to make it look like Jim had fought him off with the knife. Then Jim went upstairs to the bedroom that he shared with his wife Julie, and he shot her at close range twice in her forehead while she was still sleeping. Jim then went back downstairs and shot himself twice to make it look like he had been seriously wounded in the attack. But apparently Jim was only willing to give himself superficial wounds, which was actually another red flag for police. They initially thought that Jim's wounds were very serious, and when they later learned that they were all superficial, it definitely made them suspicious. Jim then woke up his 8-year-old son Jamie and had him assist in the call to police, which is really messed up if you think about it, because he deliberately involved his son, knowing that he would see this absolutely horrific scene. This new theory seemed even more believable when police got word that the missing retaining pin had finally been located. It was found in the pocket of Jim Schnick's pants, the same pants that he had been wearing on the morning of the murders. And this is a huge piece of evidence. That pin had to be inside the gun in order for it to be fired. So why would Kirk be found clutching a gun if the retaining pin was inside of Jim's pocket? Jim had to have been the one to remove that pin. What likely happened is that Jim removed the pin so that he could reload the gun, and he put the pin in his pocket while he did this. But then he forgot to replace the pin before staging the gun in Kirk's right hand. And apparently he didn't realize that his nephew was left-handed, or he probably wouldn't have made that mistake either. On October 1st, 1987, 6 days after the murders, Jim Schnick was brought in for questioning. Jim once again gave his account of what happened on that morning of the murders, but now police knew that he was lying, and they had the evidence to prove it. There were so many holes in his story. The police started asking some pretty probing questions, and Jim very quickly realized that they were not believing his story anymore. And they asked Jim if he would be willing to take a polygraph test, which he actually does agree to, but he said that he wasn't feeling up to it that day and asked if he could do it Monday. So on October 6th, a sheriff picked Jim up from Julie's parents' home, which is where he had been staying with his kids since he was released from the hospital, and they headed to the Missouri State Highway Patrol headquarters in Springfield to take the polygraph test. And as Jim was being hooked up to the machine, Jim suddenly stops the technician and says that he's ready to tell police what really happened that day. Police started recording Jim as he recounted the events of that day as he supposedly remembered them. Jim said that Julie had recently found out about his affair with Nancy, and she was very upset with him. The two of them started arguing that morning, and Julie decided to call her brother Steve to vent about everything that was going on. Steve got upset. He grabbed his wife's .22 caliber pistol, and he hopped in his truck and headed over to the Schnick farm around 4 a.m. that morning. Jim says that he was already outside doing chores that morning when he saw Steve pull up in his truck. So Jim walked over and the two men began arguing. Jim claims that Steve got out of the truck, pulled out the pistol and aimed it right at him and threatened to, quote, remove him from the family. And in that moment, Jim said that he just snapped. Jim and Steve allegedly got into a fight over the gun, and then somehow the gun just went off and it hit Steve twice in the back of the head. Jim said he panicked in this moment and he put Steve back into his truck and then drove him down to the cemetery, dumped his body into the weeds, and then drove to the Buckner farm to kill Jan, since she likely knew that Steve had been at the Buckner farm that morning. He said he found Jan outside of the milk barn and shot her in the back of the head as she attempted to flee. Kirk had been asleep in the back of the truck during the attack. He had been startled awake by the sound of his mother being killed. Jim said that he and Kirk began fighting, and that for the second time that morning, the gun just went off and Kirk was hit. Jim then, for reasons we still do not fully understand, made the decision to walk into the Buckner home and, quote, destroy the other 3 children. That was his exact wording during the confession.
I turned, went back into the house, under my feelings, I destroyed the other 3 children.
Jim claims that he always thought that the boys would be better off living with God than with Steve and Jan, almost as if he was doing them a favor. He said, quote, Julie and I talked many times about how those kids would be better off living with God than living in that environment. Jim claims that as he was leaving the Buckner property, he noticed that Kirk was still alive. So he loaded him into the truck and then drove him to his home. And he claims he did this to try to help Kirk. He says that he arrived at his home, got Kirk out of the truck and slung him over his shoulder, and then walked into the house and upstairs to tell Julie what all had just went on.
I went to tell the wife, what had went wrong. I had the gun in my hand here, holding her over my shoulder. There was a movement, and the gun went off.
And again, for the third time this morning, somehow managed to accidentally shoot someone, this time his wife, twice in the forehead. So according to Jim, that's now 3 people in a very short amount of time that have managed to be killed by a gun just mysteriously going off. Jim says that at that point he was in cover-up mode and he decided that he was going to make it look like Kirk was the killer. He said he moved Kirk to the downstairs hallway floor where he shot him 2 more times and then stabbed him so that his story about fighting off an intruder would look believable. He then shot himself twice and then woke up his son to help him call the police for help. During his confession, Jim sounded totally emotionless. He didn't cry or act upset at all. He was just very matter of fact. There are so many holes in Jim's story, which I'm sure you've all clocked on to. First of all, it's basically impossible to accidentally shoot a person in the back of the head twice during a violent struggle. So it's far more likely that Steve Buckner had been shot deliberately by Jim, likely as Steve was trying to run away. And his claims that he accidentally shot Kirk during the struggle is also suspicious. Kirk was shot in the back, likely as he was also running away from his killer. And if Jim was really trying to help Kirk when he discovered that he was still alive, why wouldn't he have driven him to a hospital? Why did he drive him to his house? It makes absolutely no sense. Kirk was already dead when he was transferred to the Schnick home. His dead body was transferred to the Schnick home just to be staged. And then Jim expects everyone to believe that for the 3rd time that morning, the pistol just accidentally went off and managed to hit another victim, Julie Schnick, twice in the forehead, accidentally killing her as well. In Jim's version of the story, he was standing at the doorway with Kirk barely alive, slung over his shoulder, and the gun just went off by itself as Julie was sitting up in bed talking to him. But the autopsy report showed that Julie had been shot at close range. There was evidence found on her forehead which proved that Jim had to be standing very close to her when she was shot. And unfortunately, we'll probably never know what exactly happened or why, because the only person who holds the key to those answers continues to tell the same story he told back in 1987. And based on all of this evidence, his story just can't be true. But what we do know is that Jim not only wiped out an entire family and killed his own wife that day, but he also caused an innocent 14-year-old boy to be sent to his grave being thought of as a murderer, when in reality, Kirk very likely died trying to protect his brothers. Police did come out and clear Kirk's name immediately following Jim's confession, and for most it just confirmed what they had believed all along, that Kirk was not capable of such horrific crimes and that he had been framed. Jim was initially charged with first-degree murder of all 7 victims, but for some reason in the end he was only on trial for 3 of those victims, Julie Schnick and Kirk and Michael Buckner. The courtroom was absolutely packed. Every morning there would be a long line of people waiting outside of the courthouse trying to get in that day. And the people who did manage to get in would just stay sitting in their seat. They would even skip lunch because they knew if they got up, someone was going to take their spot. This trial was all anyone in town could talk about. Jim's lawyers essentially went with a temporary insanity defense, saying that Jim had just snapped and had been insane for those hours during the murders. Lots of character witnesses were called for the defense. People loved Jim Schnick, and most of the town was just as shocked to learn that Jim was the killer as they had been when they thought that Kirk was the killer. Jim was also thought of very highly in the community. Some people believed that Jim had just cracked under the pressure of his affair and potential divorce, while others believed that Jim was motivated by money and his affair with Nancy. Nancy Bruner was called to testify in the trial, and she gave her entire account about the relationship, but she claimed that she had no knowledge of any murder plot. She said that by the time the murders happened, she and Jim had been split up for 5 weeks. But phone records did show that Nancy had called the Schnick residence as recently as early September. And remember, the crime took place on September 25th. As far as I know, there was never any solid evidence to suggest that Nancy had been involved in any way, and no charges were ever brought against her. Jim was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, which means that the jury determined that there had been premeditation. Jim had not just snapped that that day. He planned this. And in the end, Jim was sentenced to death. However, the conviction was overturned in the early 90s due to an issue with one of the jurors, so another trial would need to be held. But Jim ended up offering to plead guilty to the murders if the prosecution would take the death penalty off the table and ask for life without parole instead, which they agreed to do. And Jim is still serving out his life sentence at the Missouri State Penitentiary. This was such a terrible case, and two victims that we haven't really talked about are Jim and Julie's kids, Jamie and Mindy. They lost both of their parents and a large portion of their family all at once. And I just really hope that they're doing well today. I definitely want to hear what you guys think about this case. It's not hard to believe that Jim killed Julie due to the affair and the potential that she was getting ready to file for divorce or the life insurance money. But why do you think he killed the entire Buckner family? Was it all done to make it look like Kirk had just snapped and went on a killing spree? Or do you think it was for the inheritance of the farm that the Schnicks were set to get if the Buckner family died? I really want to know what you think, so let me know in the comments. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing and following me on Instagram at summer_SanchezYT. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.